Paul Neiffer grew up on a farm. He loves and he believes in agriculture. However, he does see some challenging years ahead for the industry. Hi, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast. I'm Dave Price. Now, to be clear, Paul is not giving up on agriculture. After all, he owns farms in 3 different states, and he and his wife may even look to buy more. Paul is the author of the Farm CPA Report, and as the title suggests, he's a CPA, a certified public accountant, and he specializes in agriculture. We will get to why he thinks the next several years could be difficult for the industry, but first, move over Justin Timberlake. Paul jokes that his profession is bringing sexy back. So you decided to really focus on taxes. I mean, that's super sexy, right? Like what, what attracted you to that?
Our motto is make taxes sexy. So you did come up with the right term there.
Awesome.
When I grew up on a farm in southeastern Washington State, and my mother was the math brain in the family, and she sort of passed it on to me. And of course, I graduated from high school / college right when the Great Recession or Depression in farmland was happening in the early 80s. And my dad only had an 8th grade education. He thought it was great that I was actually going to become a CPA. So I started as a CPA. Now my parents they had retired about that time because my parents were older. And, I had farming in my blood. Matter of fact, right now I own farmland in Washington, Iowa, and Missouri. And I'll probably end up buying some more, just, where I find a nice, good bargain, I'll go ahead and buy. So, and because of that, about 15 years ago, I started a blog called farmcpatoday.com, and then eventually merged into Clifton Larson Allen, which is about right now the top 10 CPA firm, financial services firm in the country. And they have a fairly large ag presence. And because of that, I was on the leadership team, continue to do the blog, write a column for Top Producer Magazine, do a podcast for them too. And I love farming. I have a passion for it. And farmers really enjoy talking about taxes. They don't like paying taxes, but they like to talk about how we can save on taxes. So that's always a pretty good audience for me.
I'm curious, because you've done this a while, how difficult is it where, to me, we've been doing this podcast since the end of last fall, the fall of 2023, and farming was not my background. One of the most fascinating aspects of this to me is there would be a certain type of person, now maybe you're born into it with family lineage, but who's attracted and interested in farming, that alone. But you have to be, if you're on your own, you have to be an expert in so much stuff, right? Like you could have the true green thumb when it comes to whatever your specialty crop is, but it's a business, right? Yeah. So particularly when it comes to the tax side of it, how complicated is that?
Well, it's interesting. In the tax code, the farming side of the tax code has more tax code provisions than any other business out there. So it is fair. I won't use the word complex. I mean, if you're involved in it on an annual basis and you do a fair amount of farmers' tax returns, you're going to pick up on most of it, but there is quite a bit that is very interesting. I mean, for example, a farmer may elect to defer crop insurance or not defer crop insurance, but then you got to know, hey, do I qualify? If I qualify, how much of the crop insurance can I defer? Because if it's related to price, you can't defer that. If it's related to yield, yes, you can defer it. So, and that's just one little aspect of it. So there is quite a bit of specific information in the tax code that allow farmers to essentially kick the tax can down the road for 30 or 40 years. Now, they'll end up paying it when they retire, or God forbid, if they pass away, their heirs actually will end up not paying any tax on it at all in most cases. So that is something that's unique about farming.
You mentioned you yourself have farms in 3 different states because of the geography involved here. That means you're, I assume, in different crops, right?
Yes. Now, in the Midwest, so Iowa and Missouri, it's primarily corn and soybeans, although I raised wheat this year and actually almost hit exactly 100 bushel on the wheat. It's double crop wheat. It was like 99.875, so around to 100. Now in Washington State, it's primarily wheat is the #1 crop on my ground there. And then we rotate it with the legume, which is typically dry peas. It could be garbanzos, which are chickpeas, garbanzos. Could be canola, but most of the time it's going to be wheat and dry peas.
Those garbanzos, that could be, that seems like one of those kind of fascinating. I know I'm going to make the meat producers here angry, but as people look for alternative sources, that seems like that could be maybe part of the tip of the spear, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Garbs makes hummus, and I really don't like hummus because the texture. I mean, it's just like I don't need to eat that. So it's just like tofu. So, but then I'll make the vegetarians upset with me. So,
Right.
So we're equal. We got the meat people mad, and we got
We've
the
offended
vegetarians
everyone
mad.
in one sentence.
Exactly.
Okay, talk about, I know you say this isn't complicated, but let's talk about 1031 exchanges because that's something you've written about and obviously it's part of your professional life here too. But there are many ways to go on this. And, I follow politics a lot and have covered politics for a couple of decades. And there has been talk potentially about the current administration maybe doing something with it, possibly even getting rid of them altogether. Seems a little unlikely to go that far, and who knows now, because it'll be, if Kamala Harris would be the next president rather than Joe Biden, that may be a whole different animal here. But how are people addressing this if there is a bit of uncertainty?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of uncertainty. I mean, what President Biden, which actually was continuation of what President Obama had originally proposed back in the 90s, or actually
early 2000s.
Early 2000, time flies. And essentially what was happening is they would like to still allow you to do a 1031, but the maximum amount of gain that you could actually defer if you're a single taxpayer would be 500,000, married couple would be $1 million. Now it might be indexed to inflation. But we've certainly seen a large amount of inflation in farmland values. And 10 or 15 years ago, $1 million was a pretty good size, property. It might be 300, 400, or 500 acres. Now it's 80 acres. So that definitely would curtail. I wouldn't say it would not eliminate. It would just end up forcing the farmer to recognize a little bit of gain up front. Now, what we have to understand is, let's go back to President Trump. When he was in office and passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they eliminated the ability for farmers to defer the gain on trading in their farm equipment, and farmers have survived that. Now, that brought about some unique features that farmers have to need to understand. If they're exchanging farmland that has what we call Section 1245 real property, which is like a grain bin, a hog barn, a dairy barn, tiling, a well, underground irrigation improvements, you have to reinvest that gain into other 1245 real property. You can't go from selling a hog barn that's worth $3 million and buying raw dirt that's worth $3 million. You're still going to have a fully taxable event. So a lot of what farmers used to think they could defer tax-free into farmland really isn't the case anymore. So they do have to be cautious of that. But I think you're right. The real estate industry is a fairly effective lobby. This would affect them a whole lot more than it would affect the farmers out there. So I don't think that's going to pass. Now, maybe deferring, maybe they'll raise the limit to 5 million or something like that. And certainly at 5 million, that would be more manageable for most of the farm families out there.
So how do you, when you talk to so many people and frankly from around the country, is that how you kind of talk to them about let's not freak out?
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of farmers are so used to not paying taxes that anytime you're talking about reducing their ability to defer taxes, they do get a little bit, quote, freaked out. But one of my favorite sayings, and I think I came up with this myself, is one of my favorite sayings is working capital, so cash, et cetera, that you've paid tax on as a farmer is your working capital. If you've never paid tax on it, it's either Uncle Sam's or it's the bank or it's both, because you've had to borrow money to continue to defer the tax. So paying taxes isn't necessarily bad. We want to optimize that taxes. We want to take advantage of the lower tax brackets. Go ahead and pay that now versus paying some huge tax bill 20 years from now. Even with time value of money, it's always better to pay a 10% tax bill than a 39.6 or 44.6 or whatever it might be, 20 years down the road.
As we go through this, maybe we're kind of in this slow transition where we have a little bit fewer numbers of people who are farming the land themselves. You got more outside investors in, operators in. How has that changed what you're doing?
Yeah, I think we certainly now work more and more with those off-farm heirs, or like I say, they're not even ever associated with farming, but they still have some unique ability to defer taxes. Certainly when they purchase farmland, if there's certain types of assets on it, like I say, a grain bin or tiling, underground tiling, that can be depreciated. And we used to have 100% bonus as of a couple of years ago. This year it's 60% bonus, and that allows that landlord to go ahead and deduct the tiling or whatever it might be, 60, 70, 80%. Now, we also have to realize that we have the dreaded passive activity rules that kick in, and if that creates a taxable loss for that farmland, typically that taxpayer is only going to defer that loss and then ultimately use it at some point in time. You don't lose it, you just can't take the deduction immediately. So you're correct. A lot of our, especially land holding taxpayers out there, the son or the daughter might be farming the ground, but they have partial ownership in the ground, and their 3 or 4 siblings have partial ownership. Also, another option out there, or another thing that's happening more and more, as these farm families sort of, mom and dad is no longer farming, none of the siblings are farming, and you have 2 siblings that want to sell out, 2 siblings that want to keep the land in the family, so to speak. That can create a lot of tension. Matter of fact, I have a call later on today dealing with that exact same type of subject. And there's getting to be more and more. Actually, I'm on the advisory board of the Legacy Farmland Fund, and I think that's certainly an option out there that might make a lot of sense for these families. Where again, a couple of those siblings really have a passion for that family legacy, whereas the other 2, maybe they want to buy the lake house, or they're going to buy a new house or whatever it might be. They want to sell out. And right now it's difficult for the siblings that are still there. They can't afford to buy out the other siblings, or at least they don't want to incur that debt. So and remember, the debt right now at 8-9% versus the 2 or 3 or 4% cash return, it's a little difficult to really carry that debt.
So how do you counsel these families in that situation? Let's say you have 4 siblings, 4 heirs to this. 1 or 2 of them want out completely, 1 or 2 maybe want to stay, but everybody's off premise. Yeah. So how do you,
well, like I say,
you got emotion in there.
You got an emotional attachment, and you certainly want to keep the family intact where they can spend Thanksgiving together or Christmas sure. And not get mad at each other. And like I said, this Legacy Farmland Fund, I am an advisor for that on the advisory board. And I like the concept because what it allows those 4, let's say it's 4 siblings, they contribute the land into the fund. It's called a Section 721 exchange. It's not a 1031 exchange, it's a 721 exchange. And after they transfer the land in, there's no tax consequences to the transfer. And then once it's in the fund, now it may need to take a few months to get the seasoning, so to speak. And it comes in at fair market value. They're going to get value based on that, plus diversification. But those 2 heirs, those 2 siblings that want to sell out, they can sell their shares. And by selling those shares, they can sell to the fund or an outside third person. But by selling those shares, they go ahead and incur the tax liability, if any. Now, if this is inherited ground, you get a step up in basis, and there may not be any tax from the sale. But the 2 other siblings that say, hey, we really want to keep that legacy, and typically that land's going to be held in a single member LLC with their name in the name. So if people look on the county website, it's going to show that you're still an owner, via that LLC, and they have the option to purchase it back. They have the option to farm it if they're really in the business of farming. They have the option to sort of indicate to the fund, hey, this person has been our longtime tenant farmer. They've been farming for 20 years. We want them to keep being the farmer. And and that's allowed too. So that's really a good option that's just really come about in the last year, year and a half. And I think as we go along and get that critical mass, you're going to see that option really being used more and more.
We are talking in the final couple of weeks of August, and so we're waiting for the Fed's action in September, what we assume, where they will at least start inching down interest rates. And I'm curious, we've been waiting a while, obviously, as you well know. Kind of earlier this year, it seemed like this may have happened perhaps even in the summer, and it's been put off as inflation's kind of hung around here. But how are people prepping for this? Because now it feels like it's going to finally happen here. And does that change the equation for folks?
Well, I think the mental attitude is once the Fed starts cutting rates, that they're going to substantially cut rates. And I don't think that's the reality. I think the reality is the interest rates that we saw between 2008 during the Great Recession through the pandemic were artificially low. The rates where they're at now, maybe another 100 basis points drop is really where rates should be. Now, we don't like to hear that. It changes the dynamics for us. And I think eventually, if the Fed does only cut maybe 100 basis points in total, and we sort of get that baseline and that 7% range, 6.5, 7, and then a home mortgages, maybe it might drop into the high fives. That's equilibrium. I think we'll go back to being very comfortable with that. But that means there may be a haircut in some land values. That again, if you're only getting a 2 or 3% return and you have to pay 5 or 6% on your money, that doesn't work out very much. But there's still a lot of liquidity. I know farmland or farm net income is dropping drastically, but there's still a fair amount of liquidity out there in certain farmers' pockets that are going to be able to deploy into buying farmland at cheaper values. Matter of fact, they're looking forward to the ability to buy land at cheaper values.
You talked about professionally speaking, you came into age in the 80s, whether that's, as far as the learning on the job, of course, that's probably a benefit, but obviously that was a tough time for a lot of people. So to your point about the historical perspective of this, for folks a certain age or above, they remember what interest rates used to be when they were not artificially low. But for some of the younger folks, they probably thought, hey, this is the way it's going to be for a long time, right? And it's probably jarring what we've experienced over the last couple of years. So how does that mindset work in?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the younger generation needs to probably see these rates continue for a while, then they'll get used to it. Right now, it's a shock. It's a shock to the system. Also, certainly we know during the pandemic, the government pumped way too much money into the system, and we're getting a shock of inflated values and inflated interest rates. And that sometimes doesn't work very well together. We've supposedly priced out a lot of people out of being able to afford homes. But I know back in the 1980s when I was buying a home, it was tough to buy a home. I think people automatically assume, hey, I'm in my 20s, I'm out of college, I should be able to buy a home. Well, it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
So now again, my generation, the baby boomers have a lot more wealth. We're able to help a lot of our kids, with down payments or whatever it might be, or sign on the mortgage or whatever it is. So, and that was true back then. I borrowed some money from my dad, and it was funny. He turned around and sent an envelope back with the first check I wrote, and it was all tore up. And he says, if you send another check like this, it's going to be tore up again. He forgave the note right away. So, that's what parents are for.
That's the perfect kind of bank. Do you at all remember what those interest rates were back when you were looking for a house back then?
Yeah, so I think when we were looking for the house, and we ended up being able to assume a mortgage, and it was 12%, and I was tickled pink. I think the current rates at that time were 14 to 15, and that wasn't the high. It was pretty close to the high. The high was a couple of years before that. It was about, I think 18, 19. And that was a very short period of time, but certainly anything 10, if you got a rate for 10%, you were tickled pink. So, and it took many years for it to drop below 8. That took another, probably at least 10 years before it ever dropped below 8.
So you get out and about as we've tried to connect on logistics. I mean, you're traveling around the country talking to a lot of different kinds of people. Where's their psyche? You know, you see, obviously it was kind of a jarring report as USDA earlier this year had said, all right, income's going to drop about 25% or whatever, right? I mean, that's a
Yep.
jarring number.
Yep.
Of course,
Yep.
people already experienced some of that last year, so that'd be 2 straight years. So where are people right now?
Well, I think we've got to remember we were from an artificially high number in 2022. You know, the Ukraine crisis just bumped up farm income dramatically. If you look at it, it's the same as back in 2012 and 13, the last time we peaked out. Matter of fact, it was higher. So us coming down 10, 20%, 30%, I don't have a problem with that. I think most farmers don't have a problem with it. The psyche right now is this year really is not great. Next year looks a lot worse.
Right.
Next year, right now, we're looking at still high input costs and lower prices. So, you know, if that trend continues, it's eerie how 2024 looks like 2014. You know, if you look at the future prices, it's almost a mirror image. If you look at what's going on between 2012 and 2022, and then 2013 and 2023, and now 2014 and 2024, very similar. Therefore, I think for the next 5 years or more, it's going to be tough. You know, there'll be some weak farmers that'll be cycled out of this. I mean, I hate to say it, but you know, it's going to happen, especially if they used up a lot of their excess liquidity built up in 22 and 23 on buying toys, so to speak. That's where it's really going to hurt them.
All right, I know that's our tough reality check. We're coming up against the clock because you've got to get rolling here. I wonder if we can end on something positive. And that's, if you look at what you've done professionally in your life and you've stayed committed, you mentioned you got farms in 3 states and that may even expand one day. What is it about that? Like just farming itself, there's something that connects you. Even as we talk to you in an office and fancy technology on Zoom, we got headphones and all this stuff, right? There's something about farming that gets you. What is that?
Well, I think, you know, my favorite thing even now is to go drive a combine on a steep hill and slide it down the hill. You know, that's some of my favorite things because the farm we were on, we had 450 feet of elevation change in 150-acre fields. So, yeah, it's that ability. Hey, I can touch the dirt. I can feel the dirt. I can rub that dirt through my fingers. And, you know, I think the farmers that are listening to this, they understand that there's just something inherent. You know, there's no other investment. Even if you buy a building, yeah, you can buy a building, but that building doesn't, you know, it doesn't give you the same feel as that dirt does. And either you're born with it. Now you can grow it, but I was born with it and I'm going to keep it. Well, and I am very optimistic. I mean, you're always going to have some lean years, but again, let's go back to the famous Bible, you know, saying 7 good years followed by 7 lean years, and farmers understand that. They take advantage of those very good years to get them through the lean years, and when they come out the other end, they'll be better off than when they started. So I'm very optimistic.
We thank you much for the time.
No problem.
He's Paul Neiffer, the CPA and author of the Farm CPA Report. You can find out more about Paul's background in our profile about him at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Paul was a featured story on our free weekly email newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news sent straight to their email inbox. You can check it out. You can sign up if you haven't already, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Each week, you get our collection of the top news about the challenges, successes, and changes for farmland owners, operators, and investors. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.